My name is Mike Manning. My pronouns are he, his. I'm with MESH, and I'm joined by
Courtney Knoll, and I'm from MESH, and I use she, her.
So we were asked by Minnesota Housing to dig into the MPAT tool. As you all know, it rolled out in July of this year, and there's just a lot of questions and nuances, and then how do we fit it into coordinated entry and a lot of things like that. So we have a presentation that the tool itself is not that long. So folks have been 3 hours, really? Is it going to take that long? And we have been up to the clock with the 2 regions that we've done so far. So what I will say is to start us out in the South region, which we did last Thursday, Friday, we started out with an icebreaker, which you'll see in your packets. And the number one feedback we got when we were done was, don't do the icebreaker, it took too long. So on Wednesday, we let the folks in the north know we're going to skip the icebreaker. That's the feedback we got. And then the number one feedback we got was, I really wanted to do the icebreaker. So something about the icebreaker. What we are going to do instead of the icebreaker, and if you came with folks that you know, maybe try and join a table that you don't. We just want you to take 3-4 minutes, go around your table, introduce yourselves, let folks know what agency you're from, what region you're from. I know we've got each of the metro continuum of care regions and FHPAP regions, but we have folks from outside, from greater Minnesota as well, and want to make sure that you're all aware of who's in some sense in the room. So if I can have, and I think you guys came together, so we'll have you join another table, at least for this time. Again, just 3 or 4 minutes, introduce yourselves and let folks know who you are. Thanks. Okay, we're going to come back together. All right, so one other introduction I want to make as we're getting started is just Diane Elias and Nancy Urbanski from MHFA. Your funders are in the room, so I wanted to give them a chance, Diane a chance to just say a word.
Hi everyone, good morning. We're really happy to be here, and we hope it's okay that we crash the training. We're all learning about this together, and so it's an opportunity for us to see everything that you're learning in this as well and get kind of that first-hand experience. But we want to make sure that you know that this is kind of like HUD trainings that if any of you have ever gone to those, you get amnesty where you can say whatever you want. It's not held against you. And we're not going to be here to answer direct questions today. Mike's been putting those together. And then later we'll have discussions about how to incorporate that into any guidance that we give. So we won't be able to really interact with specific answers today on a lot of the things we have to think about too, because we're not always able to anticipate everything you're going to run into. But this will help us really try to address those things as we come to them during the time that we're all piloting this tool. So thank you.
Super. So as far as our agenda for today, there's a few things that we want to hit. So we're going to talk just first about just some of the basics with the tool, just the objectives of the training, and just the logistics with the tool. Then talk a little bit about the what and why of how we came to be using MPAT. Then what we're going to talk, read before use, are just things that you as programs, as regions, as advisory committees should be thinking about, or continuum of care regions should be thinking about, since you will be using the tool, some things that should be part of your planning. Then we're going to get into the tool, unpack it. There are a lot of questions, so in preparing for the training when we were asked by MHFA to do this, Courtney and I had conversations across the state. And we wanted to know, well, how are you using it right now? What's your workflow? What's working, what isn't? What are the questions that you're getting caught up on? And so we're trying to address them all. In talking with Diane and Nancy, there's some things within the tool right now that are kind of errors or things that are going to be fixed in the future. There was also a big request that we don't fix things, have a new edition every week. So they'll be fixed every 6 months. So we're going to talk about some of the things that are going to be tweaked, just so you know, in using it. And then it's the then what. Once you've scored people, once you've gone through the MPAT, what do you do? What do you do with in many cases, you're going to still have more people that could receive services than you have money. What do you do about that? What do you do with documentation? Things like that. And then we're going to go through some of the frequently asked questions that we've collected and Q&A. As we go along, if there's something that's either later in the presentation or that we don't have an answer to, we're not going to spend a long time trying to resolve it here. And so we're going to put things in the parking lot as we need to be able to make sure we make it through everything. What our promise is that everything is going to be posted on a Google site afterwards. Everything already is for this presentation. But we're going to update the FAQ and other things so that we make sure whatever questions you come with, they get answered. If this is the largest of the 3 groups we're doing, if just by timing we don't get all the questions addressed, then we're going to just ask that we get those by email. So we do make sure that whatever you come here today with questions, that we're able to address those. Make sense? Okay, so just starting with the objectives and logistics. So as far as the training objectives, we just want to leave with a shared understanding of the purpose of the tool. We want to just remind folks in the room who we're trying to talk to are kind of the program manager, director level, coordinators of FHBAP or continuum of care. Those are the folks that we're primarily talking to. If that isn't your role anymore, just you do the assessments or other things. I think there's still going to be a lot to pick up, but that's what we designed the training, kind of the target for. We want to address all areas of concern and questions with the tool, and we want to cover things that surround the tool, the before and after. As far as the ground rules that we have, one is free your mind and the rest will follow. The icebreaker, one of the things that was mountain survival, all this stuff, where you kind of talk about what you need and not. It's how do you make decisions when you're facing crisis, and how do you prioritize what's most important. That's what we're trying to do overall with our work to prevent men homelessness. All of us across the state are trying to do it, and we're not doing it perfectly, and we don't have all the answers. We want to have an open mind. We want to learn from each other. Diane and Nancy want to learn along the way. So don't be worried about making mistakes in your region. Make mistakes and learn from them and be able to talk about them. And that's what we want this to be about as well. Courtney and I don't come with all the answers, so we're going to do our best to kind of present everything that we've been able to collect thus far, but it's thus far, so just keep that in mind.
So I will add, I obviously put this in this presentation, and I just like Mike to say it. But I would say we've seen and we've heard a lot of people who are not that happy, and coming in with a lot of angst and frustration maybe. And we're cool with that, and we're comfortable with having conversations about that. And I'm going to ask you to take a breath and just be open-minded and just be here to learn and just relax and be open to what's happening is also what we're hoping. We can handle you being frustrated, and we want to hear those questions and all of that. But also hoping that you'll give the whole all the training and all the content just an open mind.
Also, say it. If there's something that isn't sitting right, say it, because the odds are somebody else in the room is also thinking the same thing. But if it has been said, let's try to not say it multiple times. Again, just so we go through. But let's make sure if something needs to be said, you say it. Minimize side conversations. I had stated that more strongly earlier, but Courtney, the extrovert of the two of us, felt inhibited or,
So it said something about like, don't talk to your neighbor or something, and I was like, I hate when people say that because I literally cannot do that. And it feels like shaming. And so if you can't not talk to your neighbor some or say a snarky comment every once in a while, it's okay. I think the point is to like recognize that there's a lot of people in this room, so let's be respectful. Is what it's going for.
take a break when you need. Bathrooms are straight out. There are some refreshments here, so get up as you need to. If for any reason you need to leave early, please, one of the handouts you have is a survey. We're just trying to understand what worked, what didn't for the work we do at Mesh, but we're also trying to, with content, know what wasn't addressed, and so trying to collect that with the surveys as well. I guess one other thing I want to mention is the PowerPoint and your handouts won't always align perfectly. Some of that is because as we've done the 2 previous trainings, we've updated some of the material, but things were already printed, so we haven't necessarily updated on paper. Everything will be, again, on the Google site, so if you have any need, it's also a really small print on what you have as handouts, so we're hoping this will help you be able to read that, but again, you can pick it up on online. Yep.
In the spirit of bullet number 2, there's a clicking sound that I just want to acknowledge so we can all hear it, say that it's out of our space, and move on.
Yes, you're not insane.
Very
we are all
good.
hearing.
Medication has been taken.
Yes. White noise. White noise.
There you go.
Yeah. Okay, so other just logistics. Where do you locate the tool? It's on MHFA. The tool that you have as a handout is the most updated version. That will continue to be where the most updated version is located. Anytime there's an update, all FHP and P coordinators will be notified, but that is where it'll be located. We are not addressing HMIS questions. Danny Gorman from ICA is in the room. Like Diane, she isn't here today to answer everybody's HMIS question, but that is where Danny can help with that. And then there is also FHPAP guide instructions online that you can access to help out with.
And there was a separate like technical training piece, so if you haven't done that, you should do that.
And you should probably email the help desk if you have an immediate question, because they also know about the MPAT, and sometimes it can be hard to triage emails if all the emails come to me. So even if you email me, maybe just CC the help desk. They have what you need as well.
So that was check the help desk
Yes.
first, and then
Yep.
do that.
And we'll add that to the final PowerPoint. And as far as content and use questions of the tool, Diane and Nancy will be the best folks to answer those. If you're a sub-grantee or a program that uses this but not the coordinator, you can also just check with your coordinator as you go along. All right, so then we want to move into the what and the why of MPAT, and just a little bit more of me talking before hand it over to Courtney. Just the background on the tool. For those who aren't aware, the MPAT comes from a program called Homebase. Initially, it's been adjusted, but initially from Homebase in New York City. What they were seeing is that we had a lot of indicators folks were using for homeless prevention, eviction notice, and things like that they were finding weren't necessarily predictors of who ended up showing up at the shelter door. So you can have, what is it, like 70% of the folks who face eviction never become homeless. So if we're using that as our primary indicator, we may not be serving folks who truly need it. And so what they tried to do is they looked at the characteristics and experiences of folks who were at the shelter door, entering the shelter, and built the tool based on those characteristics. We had a work group here in Minnesota look at prevention targeting in 2012, right around that time, and we looked at the tool at that time. We, at that point, decided we weren't ready to take that on for for a couple of reasons. One was we had an HMIS system right then that was all data in, but we really didn't get any reports out, so we didn't know what, how this compared to what was happening in Minnesota. We also were just concerned about, did the indicators in New York City, the New York City shelter, match the indicators that are in Hennepin County or in Hibbing or in other places around the state? And so it's what we have learned is since home base, a number of folks have started to use it. So SSVF, Supportive Services for Veteran Families, adopted the tool. Again, they did their little tweaks with it for their needs, but it has been very reliable for them. They've found it to be helpful. ACT Associates updated it for Minnesota. So 2 years ago, it was presented to at the annual meeting for FHPAP, which includes up to 5 people from each FHPAP region. And it was tested. Regions across the country at this point are using it. There isn't really a national study that says this tool is reliable, it's valid, all those things. But there's been local studies that have happened, and folks have found, well, actually, we need to tweak it a little bit for young families, or we need to do these things. But overall, these communities across the country have found it to be a reliable and valid tool for their communities. None of that has been studied really in rural communities. And so that's one area that, I guess SSVF serves some rural areas.
That we found.
Right, yeah. But that is one area that in Minnesota, I think we can continue to learn and tweak the tool as needed by what is informed there. And that, just keeping in mind, prevention work is still a work in progress. It's really hard to prove a negative of if I provide this, I need to provide help to this person or else they'll become homeless. There's a lot of folks that we think are going to become homeless that never do, and others that we think are going to be just fine, and we could have helped them with minimal help, and they become homeless because we don't do that. So it's a dance that we're all doing across the country. This tool is one of the steps we're taking in that to try and continue to figure out how we can do that better within our communities.
All right. So why are we doing this? I need to see my notes, sorry. So I came up with, there's a lot of reasons why probably, but these are the 3 I'm going with, because 3 is nice. So the first one is external pressures and compliance, which is really exciting, but always something to talk about. So first I'm going to show you this handy dandy graphic, which if you've seen me speak, you've seen before, and I stole it. So it's actually stolen from Kathy Tenbrook and the Minnesota Interagency Council on Ending Homelessness. So when we talk about ending homelessness, and our state partners are looking at this all the time, so Diane and Nancy and all of our other state partners are really, and our federal partners are kind of using this definition or this goal of preventing homelessness whenever possible, and otherwise making it rare, brief, and non-reoccurring. If you haven't been in a room where those words have been beaten into you, it's because I haven't been there yet. But rare, brief, and non-reoccurring is kind of the goal of what we're trying to do in our work. And our funders, and whether they're state, whether they're federal, are kind of looking at how are we doing this work, and how are we actually making our interventions, the things our case managers are doing every day, move us towards these goals of making homelessness rare, brief, and non-reoccurring. I realize sometimes that I don't breathe, and then so if I'm doing that, it's because I'm not breathing, and you can just let me know, okay, I'm not breathing. So this is a physical, really simple, probably the simplest vision of our current system, where we have people newly experiencing homelessness. The time that they are homeless is in the middle, the episodes that they're having, and then at the end, they're being placed into some kind of housing, right? That's sort of how our system works in the very most basic way. And then too often, we see folks coming back through. So what this little thing will do, if you watch closely, so we're going to try to prevent homelessness where possible. Make sure that there's less people every year becoming homeless, that's part of what we're doing. And when we can, we want to make sure that the places we put them, the housing outcomes, they work, and they work well. So we're increasing people staying and finding good housing. And we're trying to shorten the amount of time it takes us to get them there. So the time that they're literally on the street, we're trying to make that shorter. And then and as much as we can, we want to make sure that it never happens to them again, right? So these are the things, whatever you're doing in this field, that's ultimately what we're trying to do. And so as our state partners are thinking about this, they're really thinking literally, how are we making progress on making homelessness rare, brief, and non-reoccurring? And I think we've all seen the last Wilder count, we've seen our PIT counts. We aren't making the progress we would like to be making. In fact, we're seeing things go the opposite direction. And so it becomes this conversation of we can't do what we've always done because it's not getting us where we want to go. And so that's partially why the state and your state partners, when your funders, that's what they're thinking about as they're putting all of these things on you and all of these extra things. They're trying to figure out what is a better way. And so looking at national best practices and those kinds of things is where this comes from. So another thing is HUD envisions prevention as coordinated entry. We see this in some areas of our state that they've incorporated prevention. So kind of you have one system for all of the people who are experiencing housing crisis in your community. One response, one kind of path that helps, or one kind of place to go, rather than having 1,000 different ways, but there's something more cohesive. And some areas of our state are doing this fairly well, and some not so much. And then I think we're seeing, again, increased emphasis on system performance measures, good or bad, and we had a lot of conversations this week about if it's a good thing to be judging people's programs on their outcomes and their performance measures. And maybe it is and maybe it isn't, but that's the reality, especially from our federal partners, looking at, are we reducing new instances of homelessness? Are we making sure that people aren't coming in? And then reducing our returns to homelessness, I think are the two biggest. Those are HUD system performance measures, but they're looking at all of our programs from beginning to end of our system and how we're doing those things. So again, these are the least exciting reasons, but things that I think that everyone should know as you're thinking through, are they just doing this to make us do another step? Are they doing this just to make our work harder? I mean, not intentionally. Yes, Michelle?
Well, I think the other thing that's really huge is that even if you're not HUD funded, you're still impacting those measures.
Right.
And if that doesn't click for you, talk to somebody who can help explain it to you.
Right, so just so that it's loud and make sure everyone heard, even if you aren't HUD funded, all of the programs across the thing, across your continuum affect your HUD scoring, whether they are paid for by HUD funding or not. Whether that's fair or not is another debate we could have.
Right.
All right, so responding to trends. So Mike and I get to do TA across the whole state. We get to spend a lot of time doing FHPAP, a lot of time doing FHPAP. And so I think the last few years, and you guys can all speak to this as well, and I'm sure you would, we have really tight rental markets, which oftentimes mean double deposits. Or we also see some landlords that are letting people stay longer so the amount that they owe is so much more than maybe we used to have. Or just because rents are so much higher, the needs and the amount people are behind is so much more. And I would say that's been true the last couple of bienniums. We're continuing to see this need for more and more money to resolve a crisis. And not only that, we're also seeing that folks don't just need a check. They need support services. They need extra help having a conversation with their landlord. They need more services. So we've seen the last two bienniums specifically, I would say, but probably increasingly so, the need for deeper, longer services and stuff that is more service and intervention rather than just a check. And we've been seeing that. So how do we respond to this trend? I think we're also seeing a trend to try to increase best practices. And one of those best practices is person-centered approaches. I am a trainer, I do a lot of training, and so sometimes it's hard when I'm sitting in planning meetings and we get some of these things wrong. So first, I'm going to just throw in a few of these, just little tidbits in here. But I would say if you haven't done a person-centered approach training, maybe that's a good thing to do at your advisory, or if your agency can afford it, bring in a trainer to do some work on person-centered planning. I think sometimes we get it kind of backwards, where we think like we're being person-centered, so we're going to let the person make all the choices. But the point is how are we figuring out how to make this work for whoever comes before us? And the biggest one I think is things are done in a way because they work for the person. Finding solutions that would work for anyone that are preferably community-based. So making sure that when we switched from the old way of doing things to coordinated entry, the idea was to move away from program-centered to people-centered. And so sometimes when we've been doing things in a way that we have one way of functioning, which it has been historically a lot how FHPAP works, like you come in, we write a check, you go. And it always ends up kind of looking very similar, the same interaction over and over, rather than who is in front of me, what is their unique need, and how do we meet it? That's a different conversation. So how are we thinking through our work and how to be person-centered? So increasing some of these best practices is one of the things. And then the gap between who we serve with FHPAP and who is served with coordinated entry. I think this, I've heard Diane and Nancy sort of both talk about this. Increasingly with coordinated entry, we're serving the highest needs, right? We're serving and prioritizing the folks with the most barriers and who have been homeless the longest. And then traditional FHPAP has really functioned more of an eviction prevention. So we kind of have these folks that linger in the middle who maybe have some really significant needs, but are maybe doubled up or are very, very at high risk of becoming homeless, but maybe their crisis doesn't feel resolvable or affordable. So we haven't helped those folks. And so we kind of ended up with a pretty big gap in the middle, specifically around double up households, but also some of those folks that were really high risk at the other side, feeling like those crises were too big for us. So we ended up kind of creating a new gap. So how do we fix kind of that in between, and which funding sources do we do to fix that? And I think Minnesota Housing wrestles with, is that FHPAP? When we know we're looking at some of these things about deeper and longer. So that's another reason why. The last reason is learning and sharing. So you're going to hear this, basically most of our answers. This is an opportunity to learn. I think we get to increase best practices, things like person-centered planning, things like trauma-informed care. But also, sometimes it's good to take a step back because what we've always done is going to give us what we've always got, right? So how do we think about what we do and how we do it in a way that makes us think about, is this the best way? And maybe it is, but how do we really think about the work that we do sort of in a research capacity? I think there is a big difference between doing good things and being strategic. There's also, maybe some other ways people might say this is the difference between charity and justice. I think this field popped up, Mike will probably say this again, very in response to crises. We didn't come as a system, we came as random acts of kindness in a lot of ways, as homelessness emerged kind of as this new thing where people were living outside for long periods of time. And so we didn't come with a systemic response. And so sometimes what we've been doing, while super good things and important work, that I'm never going to try to tell you that you haven't been doing great work, because we see you, we know you're doing great things, and that it's hard work and it's hard decisions that you're already making. And sometimes just doing a good thing isn't always the best thing. And so we're trying to figure out, what does that mean and what does that look like? And then I am trained in conflict resolution and mediation. And so like, even though there's like this rub, it's always like conflict is an opportunity. There is opportunity here. There's opportunity to have different conversations than we've ever had before. There's opportunity to think through what we're doing and why we're doing it, and to try to say, hey, this is what we need, or this is what we should be doing. So as we go through this, I encourage you, and I'm going to encourage you in your communities to really think of yourselves as researchers. There is going to be a tool. Is it going to look exactly like it looks right now? We don't know. But the more that your community can think through this and really dig in and find what works, what doesn't work, document what works, what doesn't work, the more that we're going to be able to shape this into something that actually works. So we're just going to tell you right up front all the things we would like you to walk away with, the 5 main, the big ones here. Just kidding, we're going to have a blue screen. That's great. Okay. So if you, kind of the 5 big things that the tool is trying to move us towards as a community, I'll try to go a lot faster. The biggest thing is embrace this opportunity to learn. I think every question we asked Diane and Nancy, they would say, well, I don't know, we're still learning too, and we want to make sure that you guys know that there is opportunity to take risks and to try things and to figure this out together. So if in anything, take comfort in that, and hopefully you can embrace this opportunity to learn in your community. So MPAT is going to try to push us to serve higher barrier households. Yes. So this idea of people with limited resources and targeting the folks who have the highest risk. So the tool really looks at who literally will become homeless based on data. And again, the data originally was based out of New York, so there might be differences, there might not. This has been one of the most controversial things I'm going to say, but we're ditching ideas like sustainability, affordability, resolvability, because we're starting to think of prevention as a service, not just as a check. And some of you, I think, have done that better than others, and all of you do great things. But this idea of if prevention isn't just us writing you a check, but it is case management, focus on crisis resolution, if it's tenant-landlord mediation and payment plans, like helping people develop a payment plan with their landlord or utility company, if it's advocacy, helping all of these things, that looks a lot different. And so what becomes sustainable, what becomes affordable, can be a different conversation. If you can work with someone for 3 months, if their current situation is affordable or not looks differently if you can work with them for 6 months. So I think, and the other part has been hard is, as we work across the state, we see such a variation on words like sustainability, affordability, resolvability, and in most cases it's based on who's the case manager sitting in front of you and what do they think is affordable. And so I think one other thing is, how do we start thinking through some of these things as a systemic approach so that we are making fairly consistently decisions. Serving households with more resources means serving less household, and that sucks. This is the biggest thing I think that people are struggling with is, I'm sure your output's decreased a lot. The number of people you're going to serve, and I know that's not just an output to you, that is somebody's face, that you are turning away from the services that you normally would have offered. And I know that that's hard. And so want to acknowledge that and say that we see that and we know that. So also, we know that serving harder to serve households means training and support is required. Yes, Michelle?
I'm sorry, I'm just like bringing up stuff that we've already seen. One is that it's okay to fail.
Yeah.
Like, we need that information to be able to improve what we're doing. And I think there may be some worry or concern about being considered a high performer or meeting those needs without having it be docked against subgrantees. possibly. But if we're looking from the perspective of being researchers fail all the time, and that we don't have to be fearful of that. The other piece is the dollar amount. That it isn't necessarily based on X amount of dollars, because you're going to need to meet the need, as you're saying, of the person that's there, not put yourself in a box of this is how much money we have for you. Because not all are treated equal, right? Or not all need the same, amount of money. So
that goes perfectly with my last point, which is
very good.
be flexible, be creative, take risks. But exactly in that, there will be some failure, and figure out what can you learn from it, how can you move forward so that you don't continue to make that mistake. But yes, take risks, try things, be willing to try things. And I think in that, the idea of failure has also sort of led to the resolvability, affordability, that idea, right? Because we want to make sure that our metrics look good.
Right.
So we don't want to take risks. We want to make sure the households that we serve are the folks that are going to be staying in their housing forever. So we don't want to try to take someone who might seem a little riskier. And so there is some freedom in that as well.
And I just want to note, I will date myself here, but anybody who was around when Jamie Burton was FHPAP coordinator long ago, it used to be spend no more than $1,000 per household, and usually less for prevention. And it was every meeting, no more or less, no more than 1,000. And that is part of our DNA still. So programs have not changed dramatically across the state from what they were required back then. And so this is a shift. We weren't asking back then, well, how is that assistance different than EA? And how do we know that the folks that we're serving are really going to become homeless versus other folks who could be served instead? And so we had a lot of first come, first serve, and we're trying to shift that to really prioritize those who need the help the most.
Sweet. All right. Expect things to change. Hey, so the point of this thing is change. And my cat is change sucks. It's a lot, and it's hard, right? There's going to be a lot of growing pains, and things that we think work that maybe we're going to find out don't, or things that we're really invested in, that we feel really strongly about, that even that our community might decide to move away from. But change is the point. Again, thinking about the fact that we're seeing homelessness continue to rise. We're seeing new instances of homelessness increase, so I think that means we're not preventing it. I'm not sure. Not entirely, right? FHPAP has always required adaptability over the biennium. So this has always been true. You've always done a needs assessment 2 years before and had to figure out what you're going to target and what your needs are going to be, and then find out what actually was going to happen. It's always required you to tweak and change models. It's always required you to look at trends and figure out what's happening in your community and how you change to meet it. So change has always been a part of FHPAP. This is just a significant one. So we're going to ask you to continue to monitor gaps, your trends, the emerging needs. These are things you're already doing at your advisories, but we're also going to give you some new tools to think about it. So we're expecting change. I would expect your expenditure and output reports, or your expenditure and outputs, not necessarily reports, to change. Maybe I'm changing, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying the amount of households you serve and what kind of models and all of that might change over time. I would say as we reached out to folks to say, hey, what are you noticing? I got both. Hey, we're seeing that we put money in this category and no one's scoring in that, or we put this amount of money in that and everybody's scoring in that. We've seen both, we've heard both. So I think you're gonna see over time that those things are gonna change. And figuring out what makes sense in your community is gonna be what you're gonna need to do. Use your brain. People skills are required. A piece of paper and an assessment tool is, at the end of the day, a piece of paper and an assessment tool. There's craft in this work. We're not ever going to say that there isn't. We don't want you to check all of your experience and everything at the door. But we also don't want you to use extreme rigidity, we also don't want you to, be willy-nilly, avoiding extreme rigidity. Sometimes with tools, and some people critique coordinated entry in this way, sometimes, where we're so focused on the VI-SPDAS score in some regions. And so, 7, I don't actually know the numbers, really means rapid rehousing, and the only thing is, 7 is rapid rehousing. And so we can't ever wiggle anywhere around that. We're not trying to be that rigid. There is flow, there's this opportunity for progressive engagement. There's some different things to be flexible. Every tool has limitations, and a lot of it, I think, is around craft, is around how you do the work that you do. Wait, there was one last, so the thing is the balance. I feel like a lot of the things that we say, Mike will say, it's this, and I said, it's that, but it's also sort of this. And so I think a lot of it is this balance between your current knowledge and your expertise, but also a curiosity to discover more efficient and effective methods. So how can we do both? How can we know that we know some things, but also challenge ourselves to learn something new? In the research of rapid rehousing, we found that a lot of people thought they knew who would be successful, and the truth was, we're horrible predictors. We're really bad guessers. And a lot of that will have to do with our next point, which is check your bias. We think that we know, and oftentimes we don't. And I think anyone who's worked in this field can think of someone you were pretty sure was gonna fail, and they didn't. In fact, they were a rock star, and you didn't know it was coming. And you can also think of some folks who you thought were rock stars and had a lot of things thrown at them that they couldn't anticipate, and they needed a lot more support than you had planned on. We don't know. We can't know. And we find that over and over. A lot of fields are doing a lot of work around implicit bias right now, and I feel like it's not a conversation we're having in social work as much as we need to. I feel like we're seeing it in policing, we're seeing it in the medical field, we're also seeing it in education. This idea that we, even it's folks that are super committed to equity, who are focused on doing good, who oftentimes have instantaneous ways that our brains are trained by the ways that we're socialized to make judgment calls that we don't even realize we're making. And so implicit bias is this concept. So it's attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, our actions in an unconscious manner. It's this we think we know. And so just wanting to say part of an objective tool is to try to reduce bias as much as possible. Again, no tool is perfect, but if we have objective criteria, we're getting away from the case manager deciding if it's affordable or not, right? If we have objective criteria, it's less of us deciding if something is resolvable or not, and figuring out how do we give people chances. And so I would say if you haven't started a conversation about implicit bias or gone to training, that would be one that we recommend. And then lastly, as I said, I want you guys to think of yourselves as researchers. The more that you have documented, the more that you have figured out how this works, the louder your voice can be to the state on how this should shake out and what it should look like in the future. The more that you can say, we tried this is what happened, and here's what we did as a result, that's gonna help you. So, did you override an assessment? Document it. Did you change your model? Document it. Did you change your output? Something was not working, something was working well, document it. Think of yourselves as researchers. Figure out how to document it, because as much as you can, keeping a record is going to be essential. And I think that freaked some of the people out yesterday. So I just want to say, it doesn't have to always be like some super formal thing. It can be the minutes from your advisory meeting, but keep a record. It doesn't have to be, it could be your case notes. It doesn't have to be, and it doesn't mean your case notes has to be 50 pages long. It could be bullet points, but keep a record. Document. I'm feeling like you guys are a lot less aggressive with questions and things, besides Rochelle, which we love. No. So I feel like breathing. I need to breathe. If anybody has any things, because y'all have been way quieter than the rest of the communities. They've been like, what? This? We didn't shock you with the we're ditching resolvability. Maybe because you've seen me before more frequently. Okay.
All right, so we'll go forward with read before use. So these are just things as a program, as a region you're going to want to think about as you're looking to use MPAT. So one is, first thing is just to think about your workflow. So when does MPAT happen? What happens before it, if anything? What happens after it? And this was one of our big questions, because knowing that this is, prevention is coming into coordinated entry, MPAT is a tool, what are continuum of care regions doing? How are they bringing the tool in? And what is Minnesota Housing's position going to be of when you use MPAT and how that works? The answer is, regarding workflow, you don't have a prescription, okay? So what we ended up finding was regions across the state are doing it differently. In West Central, they do kind of these together, they have the assessment, and then they have a priority list for prevention, which is, to my knowledge, the only place in the state that does it. So kind of like coordinated entry. They meet weekly as a team, and they go through the priority list, and then they determine who to serve and how to serve them with those weekly meetings. That's different than how your region, I'm guessing, is doing it. And so the answer is there is no prescription, but Minnesota Housing wants to learn. So you should be able to talk about what your system looks like. And the three areas we want you to think about with workflow is eligibility, assessment, and then intake. And so with eligibility, what screen do you have to make sure you know that the household is eligible for FHPAP prevention dollars, right? And then one thing I'll just note, and we'll kind of come back to it later, the tool says it does eligibility, it really doesn't, okay? And we'll talk more about that. But so you need something separate to look at what that eligibility is. Assessment, that's the tool. What we're trying to do there is prioritize based on predictors of homelessness. And intake, once you've done that, you still need to identify how you align the needs with your local priorities and your available resources to determine who you can serve. Okay? So we'll jump into each of those. Eligibility. There is, by statute, eligibility for FHPAP. So you need to, most of this you should know, but households are below 200% of the poverty guidelines. At imminent risk of homelessness. I'll skip the third one for a second, but then also a Minnesota resident or a documented link. Those three things are absolutely required. In statute, there's also, it's either homeless or at imminent risk. And as Courtney was talking about that in-between group with coordinated entry, they're not going to get up the coordinated entry list to serve, but they're doubled up. So doubled up and not accessing coordinated entry, they are also eligible for MPAT. Okay? That makes sense? That absolutely is your starting point. What we really encourage is that you as a local region dig in deeper and you look at how do we continue to hone in on the eligibility in our region, because we can't serve everyone, and how do we serve those in most of need. So many of your regions, especially like the poverty guidelines, are going to go below 200% and hone in even more. And there are other examples like that. What we don't want to do, and I'll just note your application, your FHPAP application for your region would have included eligibility criteria in addition to what's up there from MHFA in that application. If there is anything that wasn't written in there, you need to connect with Diane and Nancy and let them know what that additional criteria would be. What we want to avoid, and Courtney kind of covered this, so we're not going to go deep into this, but are things that are more trying to restrict, not based on prioritizing, but based on what works better for our program usually, and what makes it more affordable for us, to be able to serve more folks, kind of the past of what we've done with FHPAP. So preventive, whether it could have been preventable. There's a lot, there's a number of regions that have that. There's a lot of judgment that goes into that. And I can say I've had many crises in my life that could have been preventable, and I still needed help. Resolvability, unnecessary documentation steps, especially in the metro area where EA is fairly robust. Having that denial is one of those steps. If you're losing folks along the way, you need to think about dropping that. And most of the times, you know that people are going to be denied anyway. So you're going through a step that is in many cases unnecessary and previously helped by FHPAP. We are not a zero error system. So the fact of the matter is, the best we try to do, we are going to fail some people. And we need to be able to look at that not as the deficiency of that household, but the deficiency of our system that we were not able to stabilize them with our first try. So trying to remember to remove those restrictive criteria.
Mike,
Yes.
ask a question on that.
Yep.
So would we be able to say back to our county leadership that as a condition of this grant, it's highly recommended not to require EA denial?
I think that is a discussion I would have. I would be in conversation with Nancy and Diane on that.
I say Diane's head is nodding.
Because that would really help in a lot of
Yes.
these cases, just to say, hey, we've got this big grant and they really, are focusing this as best practice now.
And I usually say, when I tell people like, we should get rid of that, is that we can still say using EA as a best practice without saying it's a hard, fast requirement that you get a denial. Because we know that there are people who are going to get denied, and the case managers know who those folks are. And so you're making them go through a process that they're going through a process just to go through a process. So I think you can still say exhaust other resources first as a best practice rather than making it a hard, fast rule that you have to have the denial in your case file.
Any other questions? As far as the assessment, just to clarify, you are required to conduct MPAT on all households that receive FHPAP prevention assistance. Okay? And they need to be entered in an HMIS. So if you're doing light touch and there is no cash assistance, there is not a requirement, and there's not a place that you're going to need to enter your, in fact, you won't enter into HMIS the MPAT. So just keeping that in mind, you are required to do it, but really for the select folks that end up being served.
That's the question there.
Yeah.
So you're required to MPAT on all houses with prevention assistance.
Yes.
Does that include services or is that only direct assistance? What's the distinction?
It's direct assistance.
So if somebody comes in with services, they don't have to go in.
Right. We do encourage use of MPAT as you can beyond those who are served. Obviously, I mean, to me, I don't know how you can do MPAT and already know that the ones you're doing are going to be served. So the important thing is you don't then need to enter everybody into HMIS, right? Again, households are scored based upon predictors, as we talked about, you determine out of that who will be eligible to receive or prioritized to receive the assistance. Many of the households that you end up conducting MPAT on, you aren't going to be able to serve. And so you really need to think about your referral process, especially if that shift from one-time check cutting to more progressive engagement is a change for your region. I'd really think about who are folks who could help out there, whether it's county or churches or others, who can provide some of that one-time help, and how can you start to engage the community around that?
Ask a question.
Oops. Yep.
Is the tool hard and fast in that, let's say you're doing an assessment with somebody and the tool says light touch or one-time assistance? Is there still flexibility, like if you're seeing other things that the tool's not touching, to be able to provide longer assistance or move forward with assistance?
So we will hit some of that later, but I will say, can you override the tool? Yes. Okay? And that was part of the don't turn off your brains. Use your brains. There's a need for documentation at that point. Case notes are very important. So that's not the tool means nothing, go willy-nilly, but use your brains. And that will inform how we use the tool across the state. But you have the ability to address that, yes. I'm sorry, I skipped a slide. So, other question? Sorry. No. I skipped a slide, so I want to just go back to eligibility screen. Some questions that we have for that. Do you have an eligibility screen? So we talked about those questions, MHFA criteria, local criteria you might have. If you don't, it would, again, the tool has said that it does eligibility, so maybe you didn't create that. But you need to know if they're eligible for FHPAP, so you need some level of the screen. You need to develop that. There are FHPAP regions across the state. Some have them, some don't. So folks can share. We'll post some of them on our Google site with documents as needed. And do you have local eligibility criteria? And does it match what you have in your application? I already kind of mentioned that. Is any restrictive? If so, try and remove that. And think about when the eligibility screen will be conducted. Some will do that ahead of time to make sure, there's only so many people hours that you have, and there's all these people coming, calling or coming with need. So they might do the eligibility screen ahead of time to make sure you're not doing MPAT on too many folks that wouldn't be eligible in the end. Some people do it at the same time and everybody gets MPAT. So, any questions? Sorry, I just wanted to go to questions about the tool. One of the things to think about is when are you going to collect verification? So the tool has like housing status, income, that you need documentation for those things, right? If you're going to collect it while you're doing MPAT, that's going to be a slower process. And at the same time, if you don't collect it when you do MPAT, then your referrals, if you're referring out, you might have a lot of kind of inaccurate referrals of folks who don't have the documentation that would be needed. Thinking about who you're going to conduct the MPAT on. Really, think about your capacity, but also think about all the people who come in need and how you could learn for your region of folks' kind of characteristics that are presented in your region. Who's going to do MPAT, what agencies in your region, and what staff. Is that same person going to do HMIS? Are they also providing the services for FHPAP? If so, that's a lot of change to their kind of staffing time commitment, and you need to kind of think that through. And again, where are you going to refer those that you can't serve? Lastly, just with intake, as you've now assessed folks, so you've gone from everybody who came with a housing crisis prevention or doubled up, you've gone down to eligibility, and then you've prioritized with the MPAT tool. At this point, you still probably have a pool of folks that are more than you can serve. And this is where you can bring in a number of things. One is make sure you're looking at client preferences as much as you can. This is much more applicable to other models within coordinated entry. Where do you want to live? What type of environment, site-based, scattered site, things like that. But at the same time, really making sure that the household in front of you has an ability to kind of set their own plan. But also think about your local priorities. You're not going to be able to serve everyone, so what are the unique needs that you've identified from your needs assessment that you can target? So that can include folks facing domestic violence, or large families, or young parents, or things like that. Could be priorities that you bring in here. This is an area where you can look to address the disparities that are present in your community. And really, out of all of those who are scoring into the categories, to continue to hone in on who you're able to prioritize and serve in your community. Also look at your existing capacity. So you need to, again, not everybody who scores, this tool isn't going to change the fact that you can't serve everyone. And so you need to match your capacity for those who are seeking help. This may also be the time after MPAT where you are doing verification. One of the things that we did as far as documentation of housing status, kind of separated into the good, acceptable, and not desired. So the good are things that are written eviction notices, sheriff's sale notice, a number of things that are documented from another party. Then acceptable are more verbal verifications of the crisis, over the phone, things like that. Not desired, which can, in case notes, on occasion be okay, but this is something that you should also be checking, if these things happen, have those discussions in your advisory and with your grantee. But kind of the signed attestament from an individual, or you're trying the landlord after multiple times and you continue to not reach them, and the person is still in front of you needing help. That could be, on rare occasions, something as well. Steps, other questions to think about: what steps do you need to take to incorporate your local priorities? Folks have done kind of set-aside resources for target populations in the past. Again, we are already prioritizing based on indicators of folks who are entering shelter. If your local region has, out of that pool, additional priorities, there are times where, yes, we have a lot of people scoring over 20, but we're seeing a lot of young parents. And so we're going to, for the first 2 months of the quarter, target kind of a set aside of 10 households that we're going to serve that are young parents. And you get to the end of the second month and you're at 7. And then you open it up for all households, right? That type of thing can still be done, because some folks are seeing, yeah, we're doing it, everybody's scoring high, and it turns into a first come, first served. So is there a way to still build in what you're seeing in your local community? Where do you refer those? We've said this a few times, but where are you going to refer them? And what policies do you have in place to monitor overrides or the documentation issues we talked about before? What I really encourage is anything that goes, like any override, should, number one, it goes in the case notes. You need to explain the criteria and all that. It should have the program director approval. You should then be notifying your grantee. That should lead to a conversation within your advisory, and MHFA should know about it. So that seems like a lot of steps. What the important thing is there, you as a program are able to serve that household right now. You're not being held up, right? So you're still needing to go through kind of steps just for accountability, but you're getting to make the possible mistakes. If it is a mistake, you're getting to go forward with that in effort to serve the household in front of you. as opposed to having to wait after all those steps before you can make that determination. Any questions with that? All right. Other things to think about kind of before MPAT, and we'll go about 10 more minutes in order to get there.
So I first want to just acknowledge this because I'm feeling pretty guilty. I can't click because I screwed up. So like I feel bad, like he keeps walking back and then he's going to click for me. And I'm sure you didn't notice, but I'm just going to call it out because I feel bad about it. But if I click, it just gets messed up. So acknowledging that. Okay, I wanted to use this GIF, whatever you call these things, of this child trying to use this tool and then giving up. And I want to talk about it really literally, actually. So we have this child who has mastered this idea, right, that these are blocks and they go in this bucket, right? They understand that they have these blocks and that the blocks have to go into the bucket. But this person's parents or guardians or whoever are trying to teach them a new skill, to try to teach them something new, to think about something in a new way, to say, hey, these aren't just blocks, but there's a star. And there's a circle and a triangle. And so sometimes when we introduce a new tool, it's pushing us to learn a new skill, to think about things in a different way. And so how do we take what we know, that these are blocks and this is a bucket and the blocks go in the bucket, but how do we start to learn, hey, this is a star and this is a square and this is a circle? How do we start to think about things in a new way? And that is really the opportunity that we have here. And I also think, I watched a little bit of this TED Talk, but that was really about being curious, but the benefit of being curious in collaboration. And that's what your advisory is like, built-in partnerships and built-in people who have different experiences and different ideas, and what that could look like if you become curious together. And so that's really like what I'm hoping you're gonna like take away of like, yes, you have to do this new thing. Yes, it's going to be hard. You're going to want to throw away the tool and put the blocks in the bucket. And there's opportunity here that we can learn together, that we can understand our community in a different way that we haven't understood before. We're asking different questions. We're thinking about things in different ways. We're gathering data we haven't collected before. And what can we learn from that? That helps us do what we do in a better way, in a more nuanced way. So these are my thoughts on how we can create a learning community. So I think we go to a lot of advisories that don't really know what to do with themselves. They're like, what do we do with this time? And so here, I'm going to tell you. Here's some things you can do at your advisory. So first of all, I would say, have your MPAT be a standing agenda item, especially if you meet quarterly or if you have, when you're doing your quarterly reports, add this. Add a conversation. Get the frontline staff talking about what they're experiencing. I would say, what are you learning from your reports? Both your expenditure and output reports. I'm guessing, Danny, Danny, Diane, Nancy, that there's some sort of tool report at some point maybe. I'm not sure. But some...
We have a report that tells the dollars, no? Is that what you're...
Well, like something eventually that they'll be able to see how
For the
to...
MPAT. For the
Oh,
MPAT, yes.
For the MPAT, yes.
Yes.
So yes, so hopefully they'll have some sort of data report you can pull on that. But then also, yeah, acknowledging that sometimes data tells us one thing, but qualitative data, the experience of your case managers and frontline staff is also really important. They're going to know the ones that aren't making it into HMIS. They're going to know the people who they didn't give MPATs to. That's also important information. So, is that. As you're doing this, I think always, what is going to strengthen what we're doing as you're learning? If you're seeing an increase in elders and there isn't anyone at your table who specializes in working with seniors, maybe find that person and ask them to come to your table. Or if you're seeing an increase or whatever in stuff around eviction and you're like, hey, we haven't never had a nuanced conversation about eviction and what it means and what it doesn't mean, maybe we have to start doing an entire advisory on eviction and what it looks like. I was reading, there's some really interesting reports actually by Homeline that are fairly recent, and also Minneapolis has done some, but like eviction doesn't always mean homelessness, and I think sometimes we do default Obviously, we know evictions on records, once people become homeless, make it very hard to rehouse people, which is a serious system problem. And sometimes we take that knowledge and then think about prevention. But so some of those things I haven't been to an advisory committee besides like a training that is having a nuanced conversation about eviction. But like if one of the statistics was like 1 in 3, if you just show up to court, you don't lose your physical housing or something like that. So what if our case managers were literally making sure people show up at court because they have a 1 in 3 chance of not losing their housing just by showing up or whatever. So like, are those kinds of conversations things that we're having, and how do we have those things? So what are the new skills, the new resources, the strategy changes that we can learn from this tool, and how do we do that? And then think about in what ways we can align, support, connect with coordinated entry or other larger systems. I mentioned earlier, like Minnesota's housing concern about the folks that were falling in between traditional prevention and coordinated entry. How do we think in a systemic way about the resources we have and who goes where and what resources serve which households? That's part of this conversation too. It isn't just about your FHPAP expenditure and output reports. It is about your whole community and how you're responding to ending homelessness and the folks in crisis in your community. So what role does that have? So these are some things you could be thinking about. Put it on your agenda. As you're putting on your research hats, these are the things you can do.
All right, so I think we are going to take a short break. We'll come back, let's see, around 11 o'clock and just continue on. Any quick questions before then? Okay.
Okay.
Number, is it still the same from last year?
The next part is check your service models. So this is from the tool, obviously. If people, I'm guessing you've read this, but one thing I feel like has gotten missed, which maybe you didn't, but the point is in the tool, these things, they build off of one another. So the first, light touch, which some people are doing and some people are not doing, is basically entirely services. One-time assistance, which you might default to think is like how you've always done things, is funding, is a check, but it includes everything that's included in light touch. And then the short term is everything that's included in one time. So that also includes everything that's included in light touch. So this idea of going back to like, we're moving away from just a check, that it is also the services. So just wanted to acknowledge that like, if you're doing a lot of one time also includes all of the services. And so wanting to have that conversation as you think through these things. The other thing is that we have created some documents. I think this actually might be a NOGAS, potentially. But this is Mesh created this table that kind of looks through what are your the program strategies, what is the service that you're offering. This is a decent conversation to have with your advisory. You should have this handout. But it kind of goes through like what are the things that we're saying we're offering, both financially and service-wise. And looking at that by the different things that you're offering. So that's a good resource to think about. As you're going through this, we expect that this will change. We also expect that maybe where you put your dollars might change. And so as you continue to do that, continue to think through what the services look like and how you do that. As with anything, and again, Mesh, one of our primary functions in this work is training. And so I've become increasingly passionate about training because I think a lot of times I feel like training is the disconnect between policy and implementation. Sometimes we think we have really great ideas, or we think our case managers are social workers, so they're good to go. But a lot of the things we ask, housing first, person-centered, even progressive engagement, these are things that are actually pretty counterintuitive. And they don't just need training, they need ongoing support. And we need to continue to think through what that looks like. So these are the kind of things we thought trainings that might be helpful to do in your community. Some of them are broadly, mostly this one on the side of the screen, are all things that probably would be good for everybody in your community, whether they're doing prevention or not. And the other ones sort of are maybe things that could be maybe more prevention specific that could be helpful. So progressive engagement, a lot of you have put this in your work plans, have talked about doing progressive engagement, which is, I think the next slide has I don't know where it went, but somewhere we have a slide with progressive engagement. It'll pop up. So a lot of people have put this in, that you guys are going to be doing this work. And Minnesota Housing knows, MESH knows, we'll continue to try to offer opportunities to build skills in those areas. If you haven't, right now though, Minnesota Housing has a webinar that they did with Homework Starts with Home that's available on their website. So if you're looking for resources now to sort of dig into what progressive engagement looks like, that is available. Motivational interviewing, trauma-informed care, person-centered approaches, implicit bias, equity and or diversity trainings, all of those things would be great and would help you do this work well. So I wanted to call out trauma-informed care because a lot of people have concerns about this tool and or any tool and being trauma-informed. And I wanted to acknowledge what trauma-informed care is, and what it is a lot about craft again. A piece of paper, any tool, is only as trauma-informed as the person who's giving it. So while we do want to acknowledge and learn if there are certain questions that are triggering or can be traumatic for folks, we also have to acknowledge at the end of the day it's words on paper, and that it is about the person who is delivering those words on paper and what they're creating as far as space, as communication. Is the space safe? Are you developing trust? Are you emphasizing the person's choice and autonomy in the situation? Are you being collaborative? And are you using their own strengths and using empowerment? That is what trauma-informed care looks like. So as you're thinking through that, if you haven't had a conversation again in your community about what is trauma-informed, that is definitely something you should be doing, because I think we, again, sometimes default and think that people know what these things mean, but they don't always. So as we continue to think about the tool and how we want to fix it and make it better, absolutely we can think about what words and things are going to be traumatic and not traumatic, but at the end of the day, it is about who's doing it and how they're doing it.
So we're going to jump into the tool now, what you thought you were coming to training about to begin with. So in unpacking MPAT, what we are trying to do in this next section is really hit areas that came up as questions as we were talking to regions across the state, came up as places that we had concerns or that there seemed to be lack of clarity or other things. And if we miss anything that you have questions on, please let us know. But hopefully this will hit on a lot of things that you may come to the table with. Just for starters, so you're ready to use MPAT. Again, who should go through it? Again, those who are seeking homeless prevention, at risk of homelessness, those who are doubled up and being screened out of coordinated entry, as we said before. One important thing to note, and I think this may have been changed since, Danny, you can confirm, but the HMIS guide had LTH, that if you're doubled up in LTH, that you weren't eligible for this. If you're doubled up in LTH, but you're never going to make it up the coordinated entry list, you're eligible for MPAT. Does that make sense? And so I think we've had the back and forth, so that either is being changed or will be changed. Yeah.
So the language has been changed, and part of the difficulty with this is that every region administers the tool differently, and so, you know, Greater Minnesota COCs may use it for doubled up households, whereas like ones like Hennepin just don't have the capacity to serve. So what we did when we configured the providers is that every doubled up provider has the MPAT. So we just had to do it across the board. It would have just been too gray to be able to assign it to certain ones. So if you use your doubled up providers and you see it in there and you say, we don't do this tool, that is okay. Just complete the assessment that you normally would in HMIS. Does that make sense?
All right, then the next is just permission to collect and share data. Just reminding folks that it's vital that we're clear with folks as to what we're doing with the tool, why we're using it. There will be a script. That was one of the things that we were talking to folks. They're like, there isn't a consistent way that we're introducing this tool to folks. And that could help out with the trauma-informed approach, could help out with maybe removing some of the reminders we have later. So there will be a script. It's under development. Like all FHBAP, you have to have permission to collect and share data. You can, a lot of folks are doing this on MPAT on the phone. You can collect that permission over the phone. You need to get it in writing before you start serving someone or enter into the HMIS. That makes sense? Yeah.
Can you get a verbal release?
Yes. But when you're serving them, when you're doing intake, you should get a written release. Yeah. Now, if you are HIPAA or others that require written, then the verbal over the phone as that first step isn't possible. You have to have written just to conduct impact review. Yep.
Can you say more about that? I'm a little confused. So, like, let's say you do a phone screening, you use the tool, but then it's like, oh, you're not going to be coming in for this stage. You still need to try to gather a written.
No.
So I would think it's, again, not to say this is all about a check, because we're trying to say it's about services, but it's more about the financial piece of that. Like if you're giving direct assistance.
So you're not going to enter them into HMIS,
Okay.
and therefore their data isn't going
Okay,
in.
so it's only when you're entering it
Yeah.
that you need that to put your information to
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
All right. I mentioned the script. I'll just say again, it's under construction. We want consistency. The reasons that we're doing it. There's also questions 9 through 11 that have a kind of prompt. This is going to be an invasive question. It practically doesn't make sense if that is, you have to do exactly what's in the tool to say that to every household right before every question there. And so this script will help, and we'll talk about how to handle that 9 through 11 as well. And it's going through a plain language process right now just to make sure it will work with all who present. So then, I mentioned this at kind of the start, but as far as eligibility, in the beginning, and you can look at the tool as we go along. Yeah, the first page, he talks about the tool does eligibility and prioritization. It really doesn't do eligibility. It does housing status, which is part of your eligibility, but it scores on that as well. And eligibility is really much more of a yes, no. And so, again, you need that screen ahead of time. I won't go through the rest of this that's in there because that's kind of a repeat, but again, just remembering to look at your local eligibility, MHFA, and removing restrictive eligibility. I also just want to talk briefly about the validity of the tool. So in the introduction, there's some description of why we're using the tool, what it is, and that it's based on national research. And that was an area that, we all, as we're learning how to change communities and work on tools and develop new things, the concern that we had as we're coming in to help out with the training was we still have a lot of questions about the tool. And the national research we feel is a little bit of an overstatement. It isn't a research of Hennepin County, and it isn't a research of St. Cloud or other communities. There's a lot of reasons to use this tool, but we don't want to overstate that. And so we've encouraged that some of this be removed just because there isn't any national study on this. There have been local studies, and there has been it's been working in a lot of communities, especially urban communities. There isn't a lot of things that we know right now about how this works in rural communities. There is a lot of reason to start using this, but we need to learn along the way. And so just want to note that. All right. So then want to touch on, I think, an important thing with housing status. And those who have been using this more than Courtney and I probably saw this long ago, but we were actually late in our developing of this training before it was finally like the light bulb goes on. When you are on page 4 of the housing status, you really should be drawing a dark line right here, because there are 2 separate questions that are being asked. Are you basically at imminent risk of homelessness? And or are you at risk of homelessness? And then how imminent is that risk? Does that make sense? This is timing. This is kind of housing status right there. And so you get scored differently. And when it says up at the thing to just check each applicable, this is a category, and then you score completely separately. Does that make sense to folks? Okay. The other thing that I want to note is we had a lot of questions about what is the definition of doubled up, and what about sorry, I'm not talking about the microphone again.
It's an accessibility issue.
So what's our definition of doubled up? What about homeowners and all these other things that don't really fit into the definitions right there? So based on that, we had a lot of back and forth with Minnesota Housing, and we created a cheat sheet. Your handout, I apologize, this says overcrowding. So we fixed that on the PowerPoint, but and you can get an updated version on our Google site, but right now what you have on paper is an error. We borrowed from Hennepin County and what they have done in trying to define.
Some of them, the homeowners.
Right, yeah, with doubled up we did, and I think couch shopping. And your local region can look at this and tweak it and think about it, but do that in concert again with Diane and Nancy, have some back and forth. But just so you have a general definition in your community of what doubled up means, Minnesota Housing doesn't necessarily, they reviewed these and are in support of this as part of the presentation, but it's not like they're coming with one prescription of what that is. So think about the doubled up. Couch hopping is within, on the sheet, as you go back to page 4, that should really go under the same thing as under doubled up. So if somebody is couch hopping, they don't fit either of the leaseholder categories. They fit the doubled up category. Does that make sense? And so they should be getting the full 5 points in the first section of kind of housing status. Overcrowding and domestic violence, sexual exploitation. This is more imminence. There isn't anything in here that really talks about either of those categories. If somebody is in an unstable or unsafe condition in their housing, that's imminent. That's less than 7 days. That's an emergency right away. So in the second section here, they're homeless within a week, right? And so they should get the full 5 points there. Domestic violence, sexual exploitation, it's the same thing. It is a crisis, and it is something that is within the week. It's something that needs to be resolved immediately. So at that point, you're not looking at a lease or anything like that.
So,
yeah.
2 things. So first of all, so for sure the double that is from Hennepin, they like convened a group and they sort of like hashed it out and they like had a really nuanced conversation, and I think they found some benefit in doing that. So I think if you haven't had a conversation like that in your community, it might be beneficial to do it and sort of using this as a guide. So we're not saying it has to look exactly like this. This is what Hennepin did. But this is a good model to think about. So I would say that was.
Yeah. Okay. Homeowners, this tends to be more of an issue in greater Minnesota communities where there's less rental housing in some communities, and so the risk of losing a home is definitely a homelessness issue, sometimes less so in the metro. Not everybody who gets foreclosed on is then going to become homeless. So the definition of this should really fit within the same as the leaseholder on the top part. So you're a homeowner that is falling into foreclosure and losing your home, and you either have experienced homelessness in the last 2 years or you haven't, right? So you would score based on that.
A lot of the questions we got in greater Minnesota that are like unresolved that we're going to have a pretty serious conversation with Minnesota Housing about what to do is around mortgage holders and leaseholders because there's a line item for that. And so like that was an area where a lot of questions came up and if the tool is actually applicable or not. So if you have that and you have line items for that, we have a bunch of questions that we will be bringing to Diane and Nancy to discuss that more. Because I think that is some of the hardest parts of like, well, then this legal thing happens, and case managers have very specific things that we were like, we'll ask the question. So we'll have more, hopefully, guidance on that in the future.
Yeah, and some in our FAQ, so we had some added since what you have in your handout. Some other things just to clarify with questions, so questions 2 through 7. First with question 2, question 2A, so question 2 is about criminal record, and then 2A asks for what are the dates of your offenses and things like that. So we talked with Nancy and Diane about it because just the documentation and be able to recall and all that stuff. And it was a pretty quick answer of, yeah, we're not going to do anything with that data. It doesn't change the score. We don't need it. So again, changes to the tool are only going to happen every 6 months, but we're taking out 2As, so you don't have to collect verification of that. Question 3. Oh, sorry, any questions? Question 3, are you a single parent? Just the thing you want to clarify here, are you a single parent with children in your custody or shared custody? I mean, I think that's kind of clear, but just making sure folks see that. We had questions with 4 as well. Is that like a subcategory of 3? Does it relate to single parents? But it really is single or couples. The question is really about just whether any family has children under the age of 6. So that stays as is.
And I think one of the research tools that they use to develop it is around ACEs, or like early or adverse childhood experiences. So I think that's where that's coming from, is like, are we thinking about early childhood and the trauma that is homelessness on folks with a little bit of lifetime?
Yeah.
So I think that's what that question is getting at, is around ACEs.
5 and 7, one of the steps that Nancy and Diane and MHFA took with the tool is previously, and with SSVF and the tool that's used in other parts of the country, it's not in question format, right? So it's all just categories. And so everybody could be collecting this information differently, getting different answers because of the way we ask things. Again, some of them are fairly invasive, so when it's not in question format, how do we make sure we're doing this in a responsive manner? So in the process of moving it to the question, both of these have, are you as head of household, blah, blah, blah. And we've already established that you're working with the head of household. So feel free to just strike that from, I mean, I think you'll find as you're going through, it's going to be more natural to not have to repeat as head of household.
And 7 basically is like, are you as head of household or anyone else in your household? Like, so it's just like, So it really doesn't matter who's the head of household. It's just who's answering. Does anyone meet this criteria?
So if there's two people, 25-year-old and a 26-year-old, you need to say yes.
What's that?
So the what we decided in so like the deciding of who is head of household,
It's,
we can ask for guidance and,
we got the answer.
oh, we did?
Yeah.
I didn't-
So, yeah.
I was gonna say, do you want an answer, is what I was gonna say.
So, if you have a couple, and determining it, it's up to you. So, and that's pretty much how you're operating with other funders as well. So, that's something as well, maybe to document as you go along the way, what decisions are you making to determine that? But it's, in many cases, if it's a couple and just one is the biological parent or whatever of children, that might be the head of household or whatever, but it is up to you. Question 9 through 11. There are a lot of invasive questions. Anytime we're asking folks about indicators of homelessness, we're asking things that are pretty personal and invasive and triggering in many cases. But just this is there to help guide. It isn't, again, going to be natural to repeat that statement before every question. So the script should help with that. It's a good time to pause and remind that folks don't have to answer the question, that these questions can be invasive in some ways. But with question 9A, just want to encourage you to look at recent and major. So it's asking about trauma. And what, through discussion, Nancy and Diane have determined is we're going to take out recent because the question starts with within the last 6 months, right? So it's a little redundant. And then major. There's a lot of value in that. And if you're asking me and I'm asking you for help, and I need to determine if what I've experienced you're going to think is major, that's going to keep me from maybe sharing things that, or answering in a way that is honest to my experience. So what I consider trauma is trauma, right? And we need to honor that as we're going through. So we're taking both of those words out. Feel free to do that on your own.
It just sounded ugly anyway. So there you go.
Yeah.
So back to that question.
Yes.
So the examples that, you can let the participant know about the examples of that type of trauma in the last 6 months. Sometimes they'll say, well, losing my job was huge trauma.
Yep.
And then when you give the examples, they don't feel it fits.
So I think the examples are in parentheses, so you could say them or not, maybe.
Yeah, or something else that you have found traumatic. I would definitely encourage how you.
So then usually what happens is I'll reiterate, not necessarily just the examples, but any type of trauma.
Yep, definitely. Yeah. Make sure folks aren't thinking they have to fit within one.
Right.
Yeah. Yep.
With this question, if you, in talking to them, have identified, they told you about the trauma, but then when you ask them the question, they say no.
Yep.
Do you give them a score, or do you go with what they're telling you?
So that's an FAQ later. I'll answer it now. You don't answer differently than the household than they are answering. It is okay, unlike some other tools, to say, you told me this earlier. Would that change your answer? Right?
I asked that same question related to like when you're assessing the imminency of their, like.
Anything that you know that you think would help. I mean, you don't want to do, okay, wink, wink. You say this, you're going to, because that's what these tools turn into a lot of times when folks were trying to help.
I guess I'm wondering with that specific one, is if you know, like the process from receiving an eviction notice to eviction being filed to actually having a court date, you know that it's
Yes.
going to be at least this time, but they're like, I'm going to leave my house in 7 days. Do you go with what you know, or do you go with what they say?
So we had that question about eviction notice. So there are times where folks get eviction notices verbally or in writing that are not legally permissible. Whatever's in writing, you should go with. In that, if it is of higher risk than you know they can legally have, they probably need they may need your services to help avoid that, right? And so talking with Nancy and Diane, that was the clarification we got, that if it is in writing, even if you know it shouldn't be allowed, there's a lot of folks that are going to face that eviction anyway because they don't know the legal channels to get there. So, that makes sense? Yep.
So when you guys talk about making the scripts, so can we assume that number 9 then will change instead of the whole paragraph up there, it's gonna switch to say something like script, the next question will ask about past trauma, maybe proceed, instead of that whole paragraph? Or is that not what you meant? when you said script?
So I think the script is about how to set up the tool,
Right.
more so than.
Okay, not the individual section.
Yeah. And I don't know that I have clarity on what, if anything, will change for these. I think just encouraging you, again, the questions we're talking about in this, the use your brain, be human people with these folks. These are tools, but you need to ask consistent questions, but you need to engage folks in ways that we relate together. So stating the exact same thing 3 times isn't very human with folks, right? To remind them, again, this is a question you may choose to skip, and you can do that, is maybe a better way to do it.
So I would say, I'll stand. I think in some of the other tools, so for instance, the VI-SPAT, they have supposedly done research on the specific words in the sentences and how they're lined up and all of those kinds of things. The research that has been done on this tool has been mostly about the risk factors. So like it hasn't been done on every single word that's written here because the words have changed a ton of times. So I think that's where the emphasis is less on you having a script for how you say it. While we do want to give you questions so that there's some consistency, it doesn't have to be like the rigidity of the same as like some of the tools that say you have to do it exactly this way, or you can never coach, or you can never say, this thing happened before. So I think that's the difference, is like this is still in kind of development. And so there isn't and maybe someday you will get to that point, but that's not where we're at.
Okay, then on pages 6 through 9, we have questions about income. And actually, and again, moving it from the format it was into question format and all that, things get missed a little bit. These are not separate questions. You don't have to ask somebody, do you have 0 income? And then if they say yes, do you have less than 30% income? So really start with the primary question is, what's your current monthly or annual income? Then you guys figure that out, right? You've got a table to work off of. You don't have to have somebody listen to consecutive questions.
Because like if you ask me what percent of the federal poverty line I live at, I probably don't know the answer. I'm guessing the people you're working with might not either. Maybe they do, but.
And then there's humor in our work of honing in and getting closer to where we want to be. Question 19 is, have you even been homeless? Of course, it's meant to be ever. Anyway, questions that have come up, so just keep in mind it's ever, but there's been some questions that have come up here. There's no scoring, so have I ever been homeless? Yes. Check the box, there's no score, right? If answered yes, really we're looking at LTH criteria in the last 3 years. That's where you get scored. And some people were wondering, well, why are we even asking this first question if this is the only place you get scored? There's also questions of why are we asking about 3 years here when back in housing status, we're asking if you've been homeless in the last 2 years. What I can tell you is, as we looked at this, LTH and the last 3 years is an important criteria. It's current, of the past 3 years. So if somebody's been LTH, but it's a long time ago, it doesn't count here, right? They're really just trying to score based on recent repeated episodes or length of time being homeless. And so that is where the scoring comes from. And at the same time, we can learn about different things based on who has previously experienced homelessness outside of who has experienced LTH. And so...
More recent homelessness. I mean, it's
Right.
not necessarily...
Right. Or, yes, forever. So anyway, just kind of... I don't know if that folks have questions in that area. There seem to be a number of questions there, so I want to make sure that answers most of them. Okay. All right. Then we are moving to then what? After the tool.
Okay, so now you have to think about how are you going to figure out who you're actually going to work with. And we're going to just have a blue screen again. Once you've done the MPAT, we've talked about this, you then have to figure out there's going to be way more households than you can actually serve. And or maybe you're doing a different way of figuring out eligibility, but like figuring out the pieces. So the first thing is there's the determining if your region is urban or rural, which I would guess, anyway, here's the thing. It's your call. You get to decide who you are and what your region is. We talk about areas like St. Louis County that has some pretty rural areas and then also has some urban areas. Some of you suburban folks have this where you have areas that maybe are more urban feeling and areas that are pretty remote and feel very rural. So you guys get to decide. We did hear in some of the greater Minnesota, even fairly rural areas, that they are using the 20 urban score because of where folks are scoring in their community. The folks are scoring really high, and so by just saying we're going to do 20 because that's sort of weeding out some more people, so they're making a more targeted decision. They're choosing to use the urban number versus that. And I think as you monitor where people are scoring, 16 and 20 is Minnesota Housing's guide. That doesn't mean that you couldn't say, actually most people are scoring 25, so we're gonna say 25 or up or something like that, so that you're able to make more targeted decisions, because you're gonna have to figure out how to go from this many to this many, right? So you have that flexibility to make that decision. We've been asked about, are people priorities to serve those over 20. MHFA is gonna track it. But as of right now, we have not been told that this means that they're going to use this as funding criteria for the next biennium. But so track it and study it. We don't know that there's performance metrics tied to that as of yet. Yeah. Use your brains, check your bias, document. As I mentioned earlier, people have to be more than scores, and you have the ability to override. But also, whatever you're doing, document it, study it, share it. So these are some of the things. There's going to be a million scenarios we've learned where you might want to override.
Finish what you're saying.
Oh, okay.
It's about 20 to the MHA scoring thing.
Oh, okay. There's going to be a number of reasons why it might come up that you might need to consider overriding a tool. I used yesterday, one of our tribal partners had a single dad who was working with child protection and was able to reunify with children. And of the funding sources they had, FHPAP was the only one he could be eligible for. And so they used FHPAP. They still did a tool and all of the things, but sometimes we have to figure out of the resources we have. It was a really good prevention case. So figuring those pieces out. Sometimes we have to be still flexible and know what is what is the right way to do things. If you need to override a tool, just making sure you're doing this, and here's some documentation expectations. And then just making sure, as Mike mentioned before, that you're bringing it up in your advisory, you're letting your grantee know, et cetera. Sorry, Michael, and then Michelle.
Oh, yeah, please.
So Nancy, I'm going with you maybe for quick guidance since you may have to jump. Is there an expectation in Minnesota Housing to serve 50% at 20 or more above scores by any or not? I've heard different things.
There is.
There is not. Okay. So we're still trying to shoot that, but it's not an expectation. Okay. Just wanted to clarify.
So I think I'll leave it, Michelle.
I think you just answered it. Like, it's up to the case managers to be able to use their brain and inform their grantee and bring it to the advisory, or work in collaboration with the grantee to make that determination, or to look at the data. I guess the question would be if it's time sensitive, which a lot of the times it is, kind of giving some leniency to the sub-grantees to say, yep, we're trusting your judgment. We want you to be flexible. Do what you need to do, and give us that guidance then afterwards. And I think that kind of goes to take the risk.
That, yes, and I would say if you have a sub-grantee that is defaulting to overriding, they're overriding every single time.
Sure.
Are we actually able to use from the tool? So I think it's figuring out you can override, but defaulting to override isn't maybe in the spirit of what we're doing. So I think it's figuring out
Sure.
the balance of
Yeah.
those things. I said, like, with everything, there's like yes, it's this, but it's also a little bit this. That's basically going to be an answer. But yes, absolutely.
And I'm just going back to the question about over 50% of folks scoring over 20. You guys all, as regions, have work plans, budgets that you set up, which includes some shorter term assistance, some medium term, but some one-time things like that. You already have a contract. That is your work plan. That 50% is kind of the tea leaves and looking at where Minnesota Housing is going and what we're trying to do with our homeless prevention overall in the state. We're trying to move more towards those with more predictors, more barriers possibly to homelessness. But we're not telling you that you are now required to abandon your work plans. You're not. Okay, does that make sense?
Okay, so to determine how to prioritize between all the households that qualify. So we've always had this with FHPAP. FHPAP does not have enough money. It's never had enough money. The demand will always outweigh the actual amount of people we'll be able to serve. We've always had turnaways. We're going to continue to have turnaways. And the only solution to that is to organize and go to your legislators to get you more money, period. Until that day, so I think the big thing I want to talk about turnaways is that in a lot of communities that have predominantly done check cutting historically are frustrated because they're turning a lot more people away. And I just want to say, when we're doing first come, first serve models, we're already turning away a lot of people. It just looks, the people who are turning away are just different people. If we were doing a first come, first serve model, there are regions that are out of money by the 3rd or the 2nd of the month. And then you're turning away anyone after that. So we are still turning away people, it's just, it looks different about who we're turning away. So I just want to I understand the rub, and I also just want to just kind of do a little bit of a reality check that we already were turning away a lot of people. And it still feels gross, but it just the method of how we're doing this is trying to figure out how do we target and turn away. But we also still need to track and understand our turnaways. Mesh has always encouraged that during your needs assessment process or during the biennium to be thinking about who are you turning away, because that's great for your funders, whether it's MHFA or United Way or another community, to say, here's all the folks who come to our door that we can't serve right now because we don't have a pot of money. That's great to tell a grant, to tell people so as you're trying to seek new resources. Your turnaway data can tell you a lot of things. That's all I hand in the
Should we have our own intern turnaway data, or are we still screening the clients knowing we don't have funding?
So I would say that's definitely a conversation to have with your advisory. I don't think you need to be if you're out of money, if you're out of whatever, figuring that out, doing tools on people you're not ever going to serve is sort of frivolous to me, so I don't really know, but I would say that's a conversation to have as a community. If you're not going to be serving folks, or like you're out of money for a period of time, then I think you're probably taking a break on doing tools, but that's my gut reaction, so.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we had enough resource staff time, it'd be great to do the tool on folks we're serving and not, because otherwise we're only learning about the indicators of the folks we ended up serving. So we're not really learning about our full system, but you can only enter those who you're serving. So unless you have another data system to be able to collect that data.
And I would say the tracking turnaways often can be super cumbersome. So sometimes we'll encourage people, track it for a month, track it for a few weeks and see who comes through the door. There are some agencies, so in Scott Carver, they have like a system where they have someone who tracks everybody they don't serve, and it's like built into their process. I don't know that everyone's going to be able to build it into their process and ask case managers to do that kind of work, but sometimes you can just monitor it over a period of time, and that still will give you some pretty good information. So here's the chart that talks about where folks score. So you might not have all of these in your community, and you might have decided how much goes where. So I would expect that some of that will change, but we have some things. So progressive engagement is sort of kind of this idea. It's sort of not exactly in the tool, but it's sort of built into the tool. This idea of how do we be person-centered and how do we figure out how to target in a similar way, kind of towards sort of similar in a way to rapid rehousing, where we're not going to try to predict necessarily how long somebody needs services, but sort of continue to work alongside them until we resolve the crisis. Here's the slide that I was saying before existed about progressive engagement. The idea that it's voluntary and it's flexible, that you are doing critical thinking and problem solving with the family and the provider, that it's a reciprocal relationship. You're utilizing their strengths and things in their community to help problem solve through this, and that you're bringing skills and resources into that conversation, but that it really is this mutual partnership in resolving this crisis. That you're going to try to connect them to other community resources, maybe that's legal aid or mainstream benefits. You're helping kind of build up a network of support to help resolve the crisis. It's building on their resiliency, it's building on their strengths, but the ultimate goal is to resolve the crisis, the housing crisis, as quickly as possible. I think sometimes when we think case management, we want to do everything that's in their whole life. We want to fix it, and we want to help, and we want to do all of the things. And I think remembering that in this work, we're asking you to be we're asking you to increase your services, but we're not asking you to case manage their life. We're asking you to help them through this housing crisis. So there might be other things in their life that they need help, and your specific role is to help them through a housing crisis. And so sometimes keeping those boundaries and saying, okay, I can refer you to someone who can help you with that or whatever, but my job is to help you through this housing crisis. So finding that way and figuring out how to do that in a way that feels good to you, that's sort of what this is. And so kind of the tool and the different models and how they build off one another and how they do that. Progressive engagement is sort of inherent in how they built it, because it is really thinking, okay, if we can just offer this, if we can just offer light touch and that household will resolve, that's great. But if that doesn't help it, then we'll add a little bit of financial assistance. And if that doesn't do it, then we'll add a little more. And so it does build, and so it's built in this progressive engagement way. In doing our research of other folks, we found LA is doing it this way, and we actually kind of liked it. So we're telling you, they're basically saying, if you score to be served, so anyone over 20, we're going to serve you in a progressive engagement way. We're not going to determine necessarily if you're one time or 3 months or long term. We're just going to serve you, and we're going to figure it out kind of as you go along. And so I think that is sort of, if you someone scores into one time and you realize they need 3 months, you can do that. You can be responsive. Or even if you start and think you're only going to serve them 1 month and it gets to the point where you're about to exit them and they're still not quite resolved, you can continue. One of the things I know people who have sat on committees with me have heard me say this, but one thing I think is exciting about this tool, or this change more than the tool, I guess, is this idea that because we're adding services, we don't have to only do a check. So we can write a check month 1 and not write a check months 2, 3, 4, but continue to work with the household. Or we could write a check month 1, month 2, and month 3 they don't need a check, but we're still working with them, and then maybe until month 6 or something. And so we don't have to always, there doesn't have to be prescriptive of like what it looks like. That's where if you're working with the person, working with the resources they have, you can kind of figure out how that looks. And so it does look a little bit more like a rapid rehousing program in that way. So if you're not familiar with that kind of budgeting, which is probably where you're all thinking like that sounds like a disaster for budgeting and for planning, thinking and looking towards some of your rapid rehousing programs that are doing more work like that might be a good place to have a conversation. So being able to be flexible, yeah.
So with that being said, if someone needed assistance for this 2 months, but they still needed assistance with following through with services, how long could you work with them just with the services?
So, so the medium, long-term, would say you can work with someone up to 24 months. But I would say, whatever you determine, however you determine the crisis is resolved. So there isn't necessarily, like if you're not giving them a check, it kind of is going to be your agency or your continuums, or your advisory's role on what they think of time management and those kinds of things, and case management things. But whatever feels, once you get to resolved, and resolved is a determination. So you definitely could continue to work with that person. However, if they reach the 200% poverty, any of those Minnesota housing eligibility criteria, if they surpass those, that is when you would have to cut those off.
And this is more just for prevention clients, not
Right,
for
yeah.
the clients that over the or above. Those are the homeless clients that you're working with. But for prevention, if you have it for 2 months, but they need the financial assistance, but needed maybe 4 months on working on just getting over those barriers to sustain their housing on their own.
Yep. And so yeah, where's is this the one? Well, so can you go back? Sorry. So kind of in the same vein as we were just saying. Was that slide about reassessment?
Yeah.
Oh, so then never mind. Just kidding.
Go to it.
Oh, did mine or yours? Oh, okay. Sorry, guys. So it is expected if you are serving households longer than 3 months that you will do similar to rapid rehousing for FHPAP a reassessment. We're not saying you do this tool ever again, but because it's historic rather than, so it shouldn't really change. You're not going to see change in the tool. But you have to make sure that there's still 200% poverty and all of those things. In the tool, it says something about like every month or something, and we are saying use however method you want to do that, but it's only expected for Minnesota housing every quarter. Doing a full 200% poverty check, and there isn't necessarily like a full document, but some things you could use is just your case management, housing stabilizations, those kinds of things. However, you're going to determine if the person still continues to need your help. That might be something that you decide as an agency. How do you figure that out? But Minnesota Housing is only requiring you to do it every 3 months. And so within that too, if you know anecdotally, but not in writing, that they're over 200% in between the time, is technically only expected every 3 months. So you can, there's like an unspoken kind of wiggle room that you only have to gather the documentation every 3 months. So expect change.
can I also just note, there are 2 links. ANOCA, FHPAP recently put together a progressive engagement policy as part of their larger charter document or something like that. And I can link to it on my computer, but it doesn't show up on the computer. So that's something that is located on the Google site that you can look to later for your region if you don't have something like that. And the resource that Courtney mentioned before about progressive engagement from MHFA, the Homework Starts at Home, there's also a link to that on the PowerPoint.
I'm sorry, guys. I'm done, but I'm not. Case notes are really similar to how you're doing case notes now. Or should be doing case notes for your FHPAP for your files. So you need to document the crisis. You've always had to document the crisis. Continue to do that. Make sure that somewhere in the file and in your case note is what the score is. If you override, always making sure that you show rationale. And I would also say your rationale for what we were just talking about, like if you're continuing to extend, writing how and why you're making those decisions. In your case notes, all of the steps you've taken to resolve the crisis. Again, this is where we have including the documentation of reassessments or how you're determining that they're continuing to need your support, and then the documented resolution. So that's really how you're doing it now, but it's just adding kind of the MPAT and what you're learning from it into what you're doing. Pretty straightforward.
Any questions there of what kind of comes after doing MPAT? Okay.
I'm actually not.
Then I'm going to just hit some of the FAQ that we received as part of this process that didn't fit in the other areas or came up afterwards. The first one is how long should it take? Minnesota Housing and your funder is now gone. You can speak openly. Although it's being recorded. There you go.
We can use that part.
So how long should it take? 20 to 30 minutes has been what has been reported back to Minnesota Housing. And that is conducting the assessment, entering it into HMIS. If it's different than that, they need to know, okay? So make sure you're tracking that. That does not include documentation and verification. So obviously that's another step that's going to take more time. But just talking with folks and entering in 20 to 30 minutes. Is it possible to have clients self-administer MPAT? We do that with hospital visits or doctor visits, things like that. It's not a bad idea. The way it's set up right now is not set up for a household to do that independently, but it's been given to MHFA as a suggestion. So as of right now, the answer is no, but it may, that might be something we can change eventually. Do all households that go through MPAT need to be entered into HMIS? We've kind of talked about this already, but it's really just those that you provide financial assistance. Those who you do light touch don't need to go through, and this has actually been a bit of a challenge with some regions that we're looking to have their coordinated entry. Really, this is our tool for coordinated entry, and all prevention, whether FHPAP or any other funding, is going to go through this. It's not set up to be able to do that right now. MHFA and ICA both had pretty tight timelines to get the tool into HMIS. And so it's really an FHPAP only documentation process right now. That maybe could change over time, but we need more time and resource to be able to have that. What do we do if the person we're assessing refuses or doesn't know? You can remind them again that will mean that you're not able to score in that category or whatever, but we can't answer for them. Similarly, we mentioned this, can we answer differently? We can't, but we can remind folks of things that they mentioned earlier. Will the regions, Courtney kind of touched on this, but will the regions that serve higher scoring households end up being more competitive next biennium? The answer from Diane and Nancy is there is no scoring mechanism that they have set up or they intend to set up that will do that. All right? They're really looking at this as a learning thing. It may factor in the future though. And so the one thing I would say, especially if you're finding that your scores are lower than what you hear other regions, make sure you're having those documentation, conversations, planning that's happening locally. Why is that happening? Why are you serving that different population? And what is the argument for that locally? And making sure that that's bubbling up statewide. When urgent, can you serve a client prior to conducting MPAT? No. This is a prioritization tool that they expect everybody to go through. We heard Wednesday from a program that had been serving folks and had not this biennium used MPAT. And they said we were waiting for the training, so we haven't been doing it. Do MPAT then and just document it. Let Diane and Nancy know, but
We're saying you're in a gray area, but moving forward, probably.
right.
We're in a learning time.
And as I mentioned, can non-FHBAP prevention programs use MPAT? On paper, yes, but not in HMIA. So these are other ones that have popped up more recently. How do we determine when to exit folks? And that was similar to the question Courtney was just talking about. Diane provided a progressive engagement stability conversation guide as a link that she thinks is kind of one of those good resources to determine when stability has been accomplished. I do think your housing stabilization plans that you may have with household clients would be helpful as well. Another one, there are more households going through MPAT than we have money. How should regions determine who to serve of those who score to be served? Follow similar steps that you do with coordinated entry. So in coordinated entry, it turns into a prioritization list and things like that. That's one idea, but that's again when we talked about local priorities, addressing disparities. There's still prioritization that you can do after this tool locally. How do we score homeowners and households with utility needs? That's what Courtney said. A lot of this is under construction right now. With homeowners, what I do know is the share of sale. The problem with losing a home when you're owning it is the timeline is really undefined and it can be really long. The notice of share of sale is generally in that 45-day range, and so that is probably where they're going to end up with 1 point, and the actual date of the share of sale will be that less, that 5 points for imminent risk of homelessness, but they haven't decided that yet. So I would say continue to, for homeowners, consult with MHFA. We'll continue to try and get a firm answer that we can post on FAQ as well. We already talked about this. With couples, you get to determine who's the head of household. And I mentioned this as well. It talks only about experiences within the past 3 years, which there's LTH that happened before that, but it is not included at this time in tool. So those are the questions that we've collected and been able to get some answer. What other questions do people come with? I gotta say, you guys are quiet. Our other regions, these were full pages by this time. So either we're just amazing communicators and answered all your questions.
Which was clear before we started.
Yeah. What other questions? What haven't we answered? Yeah.
So in terms of the homeownership stuff, you said you have a whole list of questions that you guys are going to be talking about already. So it's safe to assume that would you guys be part of that discussion with the feedback that you got from the other communities already?
Yeah, so some of the questions, like utilities, right? Those as well don't necessarily say, well, then what's going to happen if you get the utilities shut off? Eventually, a home can be condemned, or you can get evicted based on not paying for your utilities. But those are steps away from what we have on here.
Yeah, so it kind of goes to like what the person you're talking to is experiencing as like, this is urgent crisis, and then this tool is saying like, is it gonna happen today, literally? And so it's the mortgage piece is a really hard, I think is a really hard with this specific tool. And I think if we're thinking about it was developed in urban areas, probably areas that have a lot more renters. So I think that is maybe where they probably weren't serving, the initial tool folks weren't serving homeowners. But a lot of you have work plans and have line items for mortgage holders, right, in your current budgets. So that's where I feel like so a lot of the questions were kind of along those lines of like, we have this in our plan, we have this in our line item folder, but then also like that some of the people got really technical about like, well then this can happen and it's 30 days until this and it's this and this and this, and it's like, we don't know.
So what we do know is the utilities or any mortgage issue, you can score them in this top area. Have they previously experienced, the last 2 years, have they experienced homelessness or not, right? So they can get 3 or 1, we know that much. What we don't know right now is how they're going to separate 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, right? And that's something we're going to try and get as soon as possible.
And it might also be that homeowners, just in general, like, so one suggestion was, well, okay, they're going to get maybe 0 to no points at the beginning, but you can continue to score them. But on some of those questions, they might, I mean, it's maybe just not a great tool, because it's not very common that people go from homelessness to home ownership. It's not a very common.
Or there might
Right.
be a completely separate line for homeowners, just like there is for double up and lease up.
Yeah.
Something that, like, because if you get the 45-day mark to short sale, you're beyond saving that home. It doesn't matter when you step in at that point, it's done, because it's too far. So no amount of money can save that anymore.
Okay.
We won't have enough.
So in my back and forth with Diane so far, that is not their understanding.
That's the way.
Okay,
They should talk to their foreclosure
I'll-
prevention staff,
Yeah,
but that's right.
should bring them
and I'll bring that back to them. So there,
They maybe will need
Yeah.
to like
Yeah.
talk to the regions that have money in
Yeah.
that line item and just have a conversation
So-
about what that looks
so
like.
just,
It's
again,
really
the-
complicated.
the using your brains,
Yeah.
are people definitely going to lose their housing based on what's happening or become homeless, right? And is it something by jumping in you can stop that from happening? That's kind of what we've been doing with prioritization anyway. So you know a lot of those situations, that's where the overrides and as we're getting the scoring fixed, we encourage you to kind of do those, document them, and then those will be discussions that will help that they hone in. But we'll try and get that clarity. So the 45 days is the same.
Yeah, almost every CDA does foreclosure prevention. I'm sure any one of them would be willing to help inform that.
So, yeah, and my thoughts are maybe different than Mike's. I'm like, ugh. I'm wondering if what the ultimate thing is if we're moving in a direction of focusing on households that will face imminent homelessness, that will be at a shelter door or somewhere else, if then FHPAP does not become the resource for those households. Because I think that in and of itself, losing your housing, losing your mortgage, losing your home does not necessarily result in homelessness. So I think it's, again, looking at what was the tool created to do and what has FHPAP always done.
Right.
And so I think that there are rubs there. And so we're going to find an answer for what you're going to do this biennium because we have that in your budgets, and that might be foreshadowing what is happening in the future, potentially. I can't say that I know for sure, but
Right.
I'm guessing.
And that's in the metro, losing a home as a homeowner isn't as likely to lead to homelessness in Lakes and Pines where there's no rental, it will. And so there's different answers there, so. Other questions? Yeah.
If you have questions or concerns about like I've noticed that there's a lot of like edits to the exact wording of the questions, but what about like questions that aren't included that might better assess whether somebody starts using them? How do we get that feedback? Who do we talk to?
So there are, as far as we ask what are the inputs, how are they going to collect and give feedback. So there's quarterly or monthly calls, quarterly with coordinators. So they will have a standing agenda item to talk about the tool. And that would be a good time to have that. Like Graham, Minnesota, there's nothing about transportation in this, which is a significant indicator of, if I can't get around and I'm not able to get to a job anymore or whatever, that could be a big indicator. So yeah, if there's things that aren't there, and I would just keep that in mind. This again was based upon New York data, and I think there's good things. There were like things that we thought were indicators aren't what we're seeing are showing up at the shelter doors. But I mean, like personally, they said their race is not an indicator. Well, in Minnesota it is. I mean, look at our data. And maybe even our shelter data isn't showing that. But when we see that our poverty rate is here, among folks, and then for folks of color, it goes up significantly for homelessness. Poverty is an indicator of homelessness. Then we need to have our tools reflect that. So I encourage you to push back on that. We're using a New York model, and it doesn't mean that everything is perfect for what's here in Minnesota.
And Mike mentioned at our other trainings that sometimes when we have these processes for other things the state has done, where people feel like they're saying the same things over and over, and they're not seeing the changes, so they stop saying those things. So then the state thinks, oh, well, people don't have a problem with this anymore. That's definitely a very state way of doing things. So if that is a continuing to be a problem, first of all, if you are a provider, making sure your grantee knows and your grantee can continue to, or your grantee or your coordinator for your region can continue to bring those things up, but also using MESH, using the coalition, use your other resources to push on things, to make change. We need to make sure that we're using the levers of power that we do have, and MESH will continue to support and advocate for your changes as long as we know what they are.
The one thing I'd ask,
yes.
The one thing I'd just ask everybody to keep in mind, the tools tend to be our enemy, when in fact it's just we still don't have enough resource and we're not able to serve everybody. So as you're having those discussions, there are real things that can improve in our process and in our tools, and there's also just the venting we need to do because we're trying to help people and we don't have enough to help everyone. So trying to recognize that as you have your local discussions.
And so sometimes this maybe is pie in the sky, but I think as we start to shift resources one way, we will start to see that there are folks that we're not serving, and there's opportunity there to either tracking that and saying we need to raise money to do this, or it's tapping other partners that are, so maybe it's your faith community is already doing some one time, and you tell your faith community, hey, our funders are moving away from doing one time, we might need you to step up into this role. And that might mean development, it might be working on doing some of that, but the more that you can track it and document it, that's when you can ask for additional money to do that, whether it's United Way, whether it's your faith community. And we might need to do that because we are going to be shifting resources around, and that's a really good way to do that. So if you have partners in your community, while it's not easy work, it might be, again, work that your advisory and your community could be doing to try to develop the folks that you are turning away so that it feels a little less.
So I'll ask one of those hard questions. It doesn't really have an answer. But So we've come to 3 months of the program and reaching people that have been in the program for 3 months and gotten 3 months of assistance. They scored for one-time assistance. I have both funders in the room that are very flexible and allow us to make our own decisions as a grantee. But like I sense with staff, the anxiety of like, what do we do? They're not quite ready yet to pay for their own rent, and we can go on a few more months and we can spend a little bit more money, but like, what are other regions doing? What are other places doing when it's getting to that point where like, they probably really need a permanent subsidy, even though they scored like they were gonna be good to go.
To me, that's the learning lab that you're in. And so if you're doing it all on your own, or your caseworkers are having to do that all on their own, that is going to be debilitating. You know, there's paralysis that happens there. If it's part of a learning environment, and I think it's bigger than even your FHPAP region. We as a state, I can say we've been asked with the workshops that we've done to have the annual meeting have kind of a workshop on progressive engagement. So we need to be learning from each other on how to do that, because your budget blows up, right, if you do that. And how do you start to tweak your budget then? And how is that going to look? And are you spending everything down on time when you're having to maintain that flexible model? To Courtney's point before, that is where rapid rehousing is a good example, because it's so undefined as far as every household that comes in. You don't know how long you're going to serve them. And so rapid rehousing providers have learned over time how to live in that undefined nature.
And I would just say, Susie, again, I'm going to say training. Like training is the between policy and implementation. It's the conduit. You need to continue to develop skills, work together to figure out what are the things that are working, like what case management skills are working to help move people forward. What are additional, like, are there additional partners we need? Continuing to think through that as you're doing this work, and how like what things are actually useful and doing it, and continuing to build those skills.
I was gonna just also say that timing is pretty good with budget revisions right now, because we have the additional money that we might want to consider bulking up multiple months assistance to respond to what you're already seeing, because we can do that now. And it sounds like we have justification for that. And then, yeah, all those other things, like continuing to learn and share and figure out if our budget's even close to right.
Well, and I think the other thing, like for progressive engagement, we've never done it before. I mean, I had conversations with Utah and my sub-grantees to be able to explore what other I mean, we have to go outside of the state. And even in asking the state, can we get this? Because that was a request of my sub-grantees. It was, well, there's homework starts with home. We have to do a better job at getting those resources in here for all of us from our funder to help bring them here to teach all of us at the same time. Because I'll fully admit, the stuff that I threw together was like best practices, taking it from Oregon, taking it from Utah, taking it from what Minnesota did, and I don't even know if it's going to work. So we're just throwing caution to the wind here, and that's where I'm really like, it's okay to be flexible. It's okay to try it and not have it work. It's okay to try it and have it work. But if we don't at least try, we're not going to know. So, you know, it's how we're kind of blazing the trail here ourselves on the heels of what other people have done and trying to figure it out as we go.
Absolutely. Please tell your state funders that you need it. And that they should put it in their budgets and they should pay for it. Please tell them that. Because we tell them that. But yeah, absolutely. We can't expect that's again the difference between policy and implementation.
Yeah.
We can't just assume that things like trauma-informed care are something everyone knows how to do. Housing first is not something everyone knows how to do, but we sometimes default to thinking those kinds of things. So I think being able to say these are actual skills that people need to have, and that we need to continue, not just have one training, but to build over time.
Well, and I would even say that if people go and they look at the tool that was done for Anoka as an example, and you find a better way to do it, bring it to the annual meeting and share it with the rest of us, because this isn't anything that I mean, it was, again, just throwing things together, but I'm fully transparent about what it is that we've got, and I'm willing to share anything and everything if it means ending homelessness for the state.
And also, I think that the idea that you said that you did online research, you found what is best practices. If you're not doing that kind of stuff, those are definitely things you should be doing, and bring those things to your advisory, have those conversations. Hey, this is what they're doing in Utah. This is what they're doing in Buff too. I don't care where, but, and this is what, what do you think works here, and try and figure that out.
So we do have up to almost 10 more minutes for additional questions. I do want to remind folks to please fill out the survey, if you will, before you go. But again, any other questions that folks have?
You have a question?
Okay. Not the last opportunity to have questions, so feel free to email me or Diane or Nancy if there are things that weren't addressed or that come up later. We have a, just memorize this right now. We'll be sending it out, so everybody who registered will be able to send out the link to everyone. We've got some stuff we need to update based on today, based on previous things, but we'll have updated documents there. Grab anything that's helpful and let us know of things that are missing that support that you need.
I just want to say thank you. This is actually literally my last training with Mesh. So thank you guys for coming. We're so grateful you all made it. So thank you. Hope you all have a fabulous Friday.